Okay, so today is the part 9 of our Bhagavad Gita Bhakti Shastri series, and we're going to be covering the remainder of chapter 4, text 24 through 42. We'd really tried to move more quickly through chapter 4, but there's just so many important verses there that it's taken us longer than I'd intended. And even this last section is going to take up more time than I thought. So I thought to get into more deeply into chapter 5 this session, but I think we're only going to introduce it and go through texts 1 through 3 on chapter 5. So that's our plan for today. And I wanted to kind of give a little quick review of the steps of the yoga ladder that Krishna is explaining here in these earlier chapters, just because we're coming to a little focus here in chapter 4, a really important component of the yoga ladders being talked about here today. So I want to kind of bring everything into focus a little bit. Right away, Krishna told Arjuna that there are two things that the seers of the truth understand: that there are things that are eternal, and there are things that are temporary. And of course, it should be clear which should be of the greater importance. He wanted Arjuna to focus on things which were eternal. And one of the key things that are eternal happen to be us, which he mentions in many places, but first in 2:17, and many of the verses that follow, he says that we're eternal. And therefore, he says that with focused determination, and this is in 2:41, that we should not have as a goal anything that's temporary, anything that's part of this world, that we should aim for transcendence. He says, be beyond the three modes of material nature, aim for the eternal. He says right away, he says you can become Amrit, or without death. So he said, but that takes a certain strong focus and determination. Vyavasa Atmaka Buddhir was the word used in 241, that one has to have a really resolute determination and a real focus and understanding there. And then he says that he says one doesn't have even the right to claim the material results of one's own actions in the world, because this is the thing he's going to try to tell him to do. He says that people generally act because they want to get something. There's a motivation involved, that they can get something, or something pleasant, or avoid something unpleasant. But he says, actually, people don't have a right to that. He says that you have a right to perform your duty in 247. But he says that you're not legitimately entitled to the results of your actions. And why he explains that earlier, actually, hints at it a little bit when he mentions that the soul doesn't kill or isn't killed. And then later on in 327, he makes it clear. He says the soul needs help in order to act in the world. So the actual physical apparatus that we have, the mind and the body, is helped out by other forces of the universe. So we can't actually operate that on our own. It's reacting to our intentions, but we can't operate it independently. And so therefore we can't claim credit for it. So he says, and that's another reason why not to be so attached to the fruits of activities, because therefore he says he wants Arjuna to do his duty. That was the first thing he told him, but without a desire for anything material. So he said, look, you're not even entitled to those things. It doesn't take you towards liberation, which is what I'm asking you to do. So please, do your duty, but don't do it for these material motivations. And so he says in 251 and 319, that if he takes up that path, doing his duty without a desire for anything material, that he says in 249, that in 251 and 319, he says that's going to lead you to liberation, to something eternal, not temporary. So that's his beginning. And then at the end of chapter 2, verses 255 through 272, he talks about the qualities and characteristics of someone whose practice of karma yoga, that's what he's talking about, doing his duty without desiring the material results. What happens when that practice becomes more mature and real knowledge begins to dawn on them is that in the yoga ladder, it means that the karma yoga is transitioning towards jnana, or the yoga of knowledge. And Krishna says that there's some things that need to happen in order for that to take place, just besides their regular practice. And so first of all, he says in 259 that the practitioner needs to have a higher taste. It's just too hard to control oneself otherwise. The word is a param drishtva, or an experience of the divine as supreme. Prabhupada translates it as the higher taste. And that's, so that in order for us to develop deeper knowledge and realization, we have to be able to have some connection with something that's greater. We have to have some tangible, palpable contact with something that's higher than our current experience. Otherwise, it's hard to keep that resolute determination. And then it says also that the practitioner must fix his consciousness on Krishna. And that's in 261. And at this point, it's not really very much explained, and it's not going to be really truly explained until we get into the middle 6 chapters, 7 through 12, which talk directly about bhakti, which is the heart and soul of everything that the Bhagavad Gita is teaching. And then in chapter 3, he mentions that everyone has to perform some kind of sacrifice. Work for Vishnu, yajna. And he says that sacrifice also can contribute to liberation. He says that in 310. But everybody, whether they're on a deeply spiritual path, looking for transcendence, or just trying to live peacefully in this world, has to do that because we are living on things that are provided by others. The food, the rain, the wind, the sun, all these things are provided for us. We don't own them. We didn't produce them. And so it says we have to give back. We have to show some appreciation. Otherwise, we're thieves. And then in 419 through 23, he again takes up that description of somebody who has this deep realization and is coming to the point of jnana yoga, like he described at the end of chapter 2. And he gives some different details there. And then in that section, and now that's the section just before the one we're starting. We finished with that last week. And so in the section we're picking up today, he reveals actually 2 more things that are required for us to transition, or for Arjuna or a practitioner of the yoga ladder to transition just from the karma yoga to the jnana yoga, to allow that practice to deepen and the realization to come about. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Here for this first section of chapter 4, we're covering 24 through 34. And he says that in this section, he says that transcendental knowledge, this jnana, comes from performing sacrifice in a particular way, and also by taking shelter of a spiritual master. It lists these 2 other. He said before there was a higher taste, there was performing one's duty while remembering Krishna. These things were there. And now a particular type of sacrifice. They talked about sacrifice in chapter 3 and mentioned kind of those 2 different things. That we have to perform sacrifice out of gratitude for the material things that we have, but also it can be done in a way that produces liberation, but that wasn't so much described. It said that the transcendence was in sacrifice, but it didn't tell us how to get it out. It's in there, but how to bring it out. And so that's what we're going to hear here, particularly in this next verse, 24. Brahmarpanam brahmahavir brahmagno brahmanahutam brahmayavatena gantavyam brahmakarma samadhina. Now Prabhupada's translation, this is an important verse both for the yoga ladder and also a really powerful one for the process of bhakti. And so Prabhupada, he gives a very bhakti-centered translation here. He says, a person who is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness is sure to attain the spiritual kingdom because of his full contribution to spiritual activities, in which the consummation is absolute and that which is offered is of the same spiritual nature. That's what he says. But in the verse, it's a description of a kind of a typical fire sacrifice. This is the image that's given. And that's going to be used as a metaphor later on in the other types of sacrifices given. So it's kind of the prototypical type of sacrifice is the fire sacrifice in the Vedic culture. And so in the verse itself, and you can see some of it in Prabhupada's word for word, they're describing different aspects of that sacrifice. There's 5 of them. I've taken this some from the commentators of Baladev Vijayabhushan and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, but also from our own Garuda Das, disciple of Srila Prabhupada, who made an academic, very literal translation of the Bhagavad Gita. And he says there's 5 elements of a fire sacrifice described in this verse. And the first is the arpanam, and he says it's the ritual instrument. And if you can see the PowerPoint, we have the little ladle of that's used for pouring butter into one of the types. It's used for pouring butter into the fire, or ghee actually. And then there's the havi, which is the butter or the ghee, which is offered to the fire. The agnau, the fire, to which the ghee is poured. And then the hutam, the actual offering or the pouring, as he says, the pouring of the ladle full of ghee into the fire. And then there's samadhina, and Prabhupada says by complete absorption. It's our mentality, our focus, our intention, our meditation, as Garuda Prabhu says. So there's a certain, and this is really the most important part of this particular situation here. The most important of the 5 ingredients for unlocking the transcendence in the sacrifice and allowing the sacrifice to be more than just gratitude for something material or a way to get something else material, but actually to lead one towards liberation and transcendence. It's this particular attitude, and that's what's being described in the verse, and where it says that. So someone who's in complete absorption, they look at all those things, all those they look at the instruments of offering, whatever it may be. If it's the fire sacrifice, we're looking at that ladle, the ghee that's offered, the act of offering, the receptacle of the offering, the fire. As they say, they all originate in Brahman. They have a transcendental origin. That the Supreme Brahman is the source of everything. And then they also consider themselves to be Brahman because they're spirit souls. As Prabhupada translates it, Brahmana, by the spirit soul, offers it. So they consider themselves to be in essence transcendental, coming from Brahman. And all of the ingredients as well as the activity, because they're coming from Brahman, they consider them to be Brahman. So with that attitude comes a different result than if that attitude or understanding is not there. So one who performs sacrifice with the proper understanding attains Brahman. The words Brahmayava tena gantavyam. Prabhupada calls that the spiritual kingdom. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because he's giving a very bhakti-centered understanding of this. So what happens then is and the reason why they're talking a lot about Brahman in this verse is that the practitioners of jnana are generally attracted to the Brahma Jyoti more than to the Lord's personal form. Because they do not have the kind of sophisticated understanding of the Lord's form that we received from Ishopanishad, they will be inclined to think that the all-pervading aspect of the Supreme is more important. They understand that there's something beyond this world, and there's something from which everything else arises, this world arises. That much they can understand. But when you just look from from our experience here in this world, and from the ability of us to think logically and to try to speculate in various ways, it would make sense to us that the source of everything would be this kind of all-pervasive thing. It couldn't be another thing. That's what people generally we talked about this quite a bit when we discussed Ishopanishad. It's just a natural conclusion for people. And so the Jnanis will tend to think that they may understand there's a personal form of the Lord, but they will tend to think that personal form is more kind of like a dumbed-down version that's meant just to be able to interact with us. Not that that part is actually the supreme, and that the Brahman part, the all-pervasive part, is simply a fragment of the Lord, the personal form. We described in detail about how that happens, and that there's the real understanding of the form of the Lord is that he has a completely unique type of form. That nothing else compares to that, and we shouldn't extrapolate from our experience with having a form and a location onto the Lord's form. But they can't quite grasp that yet. So they're thinking more in terms of Brahman, where the bhaktas will think about the Lord who's the source of the Brahman. In chapter 7, we will discover that when their understanding changes, and they can understand that Brahman comes from the Lord's personal form, then they'll become bhaktas or devotees. That's their one. There's a couple transitions from the jnanis to devotees. One of them is that, particularly when they go right from jnanis, when this is their knowledge matures and they understand, wait, this is Vasudevam Sarvamati, Vasudeva or Krishna is the source of everything, is everything. Then they'll take up bhakti. Now, Prabhupada, he gives a really powerful bhakti-centered explanation of this verse 24. And there's a couple, I said that for bhaktas, the complete absorption is on Krishna, who is considered the ultimate cause beyond Brahman. So the karma yogi / jnana yogi is thinking more about Brahman. That's their meditation, because they don't have a clear understanding yet of Bhagavan, of the Lord's form and its position, and his position. But the bhaktas do that, and so their absorption is on Krishna. And Prabhupada says in the purport to 424, the Lord is spiritual, and the rays of his transcendental body are called Brahmajyotir, his spiritual effulgence. So that's the understanding that the bhaktas will have. A little bit different from the jnanis. And then when the devotee is absorbed in thinking of Krishna, all actions become sacrifices. So this is one wonderful advantage of bhakti, is that everything can be a sacrifice. And Prabhupada says, in the purport he explains this, he says, when the mind is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, it is said to be in samadhi or trance. Anything done in such transcendental consciousness is called yajna, or sacrifice for the absolute. Okay. And I previously noted that where Prabhupada translates in Brahmayava tena gantavyam, they attain Brahman, he translates that Brahma as the spiritual kingdom. Because there's different levels to transcendence. And we talked about that also at length in Ishopanishad, where the person at the end was asking for the Lord to remove his effulgence, because he wasn't able to see his face. Remove the Brahman effulgence so I can see your face, which is beyond that. And already Krishna mentioned earlier here in the 4th chapter that people come to him. That if you understand his existence and his activities are transcendental, you'll come to him. So the devotees will have that type of liberation and transcendence. So Prabhupada integrates that into his word-for-word translation. And then Prabhupada gives something really, really interesting. That this doesn't happen with the jnanis, even performing sacrifice with that particular attitude, seeing themselves and everything else, including the action, as products of Brahman. Prabhupada says that when we do bhakti, we're able to convert matter into spirit. And he gives these taken two excerpts from his purport in 424. And he says, the more the activities of the material world are performed in Krishna consciousness, or for Vishnu only, the more the atmosphere becomes spiritualized by complete absorption. So he uses the complete absorption in a little different way. We're completely, the bhaktas are completely absorbed in thinking of Krishna, and everything is being products of him, his creations. But he says also by that then, not just are we thinking, but actually the things used in sacrifice actually become transformed. There's an actual transformation that takes place. With the jnanis, they're thinking that it's Brahman, and it awakens a transcendental knowledge in them. By that meditation and by their actions, they become purified. They begin to see things in a deeper way. They are moving towards transcending things themselves. But here with bhakti, it says that actually the things used become spiritualized. And Prabhupada says in another excerpt from that same purport, the absolute truth covered by Maya is called matter. Matter dovetailed for the cause of the absolute truth regains its spiritual quality. Krishna consciousness is the process of converting the illusory consciousness into Brahman, or the Supreme. And we use that in so many ways in bhakti. One of the primary things we do is we offer food to Krishna, which then turns into prasadam. And not only, it's not just us. It's not just a question of that I'm meditating that the food is originates from Krishna, and that I'm part and parcel of Krishna, and that I'm preparing the food and offering the food to Krishna, and just so then for me, the whole activity is spiritualized. But if I take that same food, that prasadam that's been offered, and I give it to somebody else who has no idea what it is, they don't have that complete absorption. They don't have the right attitude. They don't even know or have any faith in transcendence or anything. If they're given that food, it has an effect upon them. So it's actually transformed into spirit. When Prabhupada said our temples are like embassies from the spiritual world. So if the activities there are done for Krishna, the atmosphere gets changed in a very tangible, palpable way that even people who have no understanding can feel. So this is quite interesting. That isn't present as much for the other folks. Although the food in sacrifice can be given. We mentioned about that food that's offered in chapter 3. That actually kind of remains that way. But usually that's going to be given to it's going to be given to persons who participate in the sacrifice. But with bhakti, the whole area, everything is transformed and converted into spiritual energy. And so it's a more powerful process. And then in 425, Krishna says, some yogis perfectly worship the demigods by offering different sacrifices to them, and some offer sacrifices in the fire of the Supreme Brahman. So here we're contrasting the different attitudes and purposes of sacrifice. We mentioned about those two things. Sometimes they're done for, properly out of gratitude and for material things, and sometimes they're aimed at liberation. And so here's two different sorts of folks here. Actually, Prabhupada, he identifies three different types of people here. He talks about, and he says, in other words, the fruitive workers sacrifice their material possessions for material enjoyment, whereas the impersonalist sacrifices his material designations with a view to merging into the existence of the Supreme. For the impersonalist, the fire altar of sacrifice is the Supreme Brahman, and the offering is the self being consumed by the fire of Brahman. The Krishna conscious person, there's the third type, So fruitive workers, impersonalists, and Krishna conscious people, like Arjuna, however, sacrifices everything for the satisfaction of Krishna, and thus all his material possessions, as well as his own self, everything is sacrificed for Krishna. Thus he is the first-class yogi, but he does not lose his individual existence. So Prabhupada includes the bhakta in there. So there's otherwise there's the person who's the fruitive worker is somebody who's trying to get a material result from their activity. Their work comes to fruition. And for the jnani, Prabhupada calls them here the impersonalists, they're thinking more of Brahman. They will, they're looking to attain Brahman, the Brahman effulgence. And he mentions, and there's also the devotees who are trying to attain Krishna. So for the jnani and the Krishna conscious person, they're aiming for transcendence, but there is a different gradation there. Krishna just hasn't talked a lot about that yet. He talked earlier about Brahma Nirvanam in chapter 2, and then in chapter 4 he talked about coming to me. So he really did differentiate, but he hasn't explained it carefully, which he'll do more later. So those two, the jnanis, the Prabhupada calls them the impersonalist, and the Krishna conscious people are aiming at transcendence, and whereas others are not. And so the recommendation here, as Krishna's been giving all along, is to aim for transcendence. So then there's a list of different types of sacrifices, and these we're not going to deal with in any kind of detail because they're not so applicable to our lives, but they're meant for different sorts of folks. So that's why it says for some. This is in 426, and Prabhupada says these are the brahmacharis, the celibate persons, the students. They sacrifice the hearing process and the senses in the fire of mental control. So they're using using that fire sacrifice as a metaphor now. So in the fire sacrifice, you offer the ghee or whatever other offerable item into the fire. So that's the receptacle. So here it says that they offer their hearing and their senses into mental control. They're controlling those things. And others, the householders, sacrifice the objects of the senses in the fire of the senses. So in that case, they're trying to, they're actually using their senses, but they're trying to be unattached to them, to the results of their activities. And 427, this is others who are interested in achieving self-realization through control of the mind and senses, offer the functions of all the senses and the life breath as oblations into the fire of the controlled mind. And 428, having accepted strict vows, some become enlightened by sacrificing their possessions, and others by performing severe austerities, by practicing the yoga of eightfold mysticism, or by studying the Vedas to advance in transcendental knowledge. And 429, still others who are inclined to the process of breath restraint to remain in trance, practice by offering the movement of the outgoing breath into the incoming, and the incoming breath into the outgoing, and thus at last remain in trance, stopping all breathing. Others curtailing the eating process after the outgoing, offer the outgoing breath onto itself. So in 428, in the purport, Prabhupada says, all these yogis are faithfully engaged in different types of sacrifice and are seeking a higher status of life. Krishna consciousness, however, is different from these because it is the direct service of the Supreme Lord. Krishna consciousness cannot be attained by any one of the above-mentioned types of sacrifice, but can be attained only by the mercy of the Lord and his bona fide devotees. Therefore, Krishna consciousness is transcendental. So Prabhupada is again pointing out that the path that Krishna is describing of the yoga ladder is not something that's practical for us in this day and age. And we, of course, he mentioned already that all of our activities in the service of the Lord are technically sacrifices. And we also know that the particular sacrifice that we do, though, if there's one thing that will be our central sacrifice, is the chanting of the names of God, both congregationally and individually, meditationally. And that's called the Sankirtan sacrifice, or yajna. And so he's saying that these things, of course, Krishna is going to try to take these people up the yoga ladder to the point of bhakti. So it was possible in previous times. These days, there's no one, basically. Very few people could traverse this process. So Prabhupada is just saying that, so he's not wanting people to think that these are the main recommendations that Krishna is giving, that we should try to take up these other processes of sacrifice. We have our own, and that will be most effective for us. And likely these other ones won't help us out very much. And we also, in this day and age, he talks about here, he says, but that Krishna consciousness can be attained by the mercy of the Lord and his devotees. Because that's what we're going to find out also later on, is that there are other paths that lead to bhakti, but they almost all require, all the other ones do, I guess, actually, some measure of self-control, a whole lot of pious activities. And here in this day and age, these things are very scarce, and there's precious little of them. And generally we are encumbered by a whole lot of sinful activities and sinful reactions on us. Our behavior isn't usually very up to standard. And so generally all the other pathways to bhakti are just not practical for us. And so the one that's available is the direct mercy from the Lord or his devotee. And we'll talk about that a lot more in later part of the Bhagavad Gita, and then also very, very much when we reach the nectar of devotion. So 430, Sarve Piete Yajna Vido Yajna Shapita Kalmashaha Yajna Shishtamrita Bhujo Yanti Brahma Sanatanam. All these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice, it means that they have that kind of absorption, that right attitude, become cleansed of sinful reactions, and having tasted the nectar of the results of sacrifices, they advance towards the supreme eternal atmosphere. The commentators say that this yajna shishta, the result of these performances, also means that they attain the necessities, the material, physical necessities of life. They get those things, but that's not their purpose. Otherwise, they're cleansed of the sins. What does it say? Kalmashaha, sinful reactions. So they're yajna shapita kalmashaha. They're cleansed as a result of those, because of the sacrifice. They're being cleansed of the sinful reactions, and then they approach yanti Brahma, the supreme sanatam, eternal atmosphere. So for the devotees, that's going to be Krishna and his personal association, and for the jnanis, they're approaching Brahman. And then in his purport to 430, Srila Prabhupada says, all the above mentioned sacrifices help one to become cleansed of the sinful reactions of material existence. By this advancement in life, not only does one become happy and opulent in this life, but also, at the end, he enters into the eternal kingdom of God, either merging into the impersonal Brahman or associating with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. So again, that's for somebody who has that proper understanding that Krishna mentioned in 424. So here in text 31 and 32, Krishna kind of repeats that, what he mentioned in chapter 3. He says, O best of the Kuru dynasty, without sacrifice, one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What then of the next? And in 432 he says, all these different types of sacrifice are approved by the Vedas, and all of them are born of different types of work. Knowing them as such, you will become liberated. So he's saying that everyone, whether on a transcendental mission or not, needs to perform sacrifice. He mentioned that, and he said that someone who doesn't perform the cycle of sacrifices lives in vain in chapter 3. And here he says they can't be happy, even now or in the next life. Because, as he said in chapter 3, we're thieves if we don't show some gratitude for the things we're given. We tend to just assume that, well, we're here and the world is here and it's just open season, but actually it's coming from higher powers. And if we don't show some reciprocation, then we get a karmic reaction for that. And so he says all these different processes described are appropriate for different people, depending upon in some cases it was their ashram, or their brahmacharis or householders or such. Other times it may be their occupation, or just their level of spiritual advancement. And so some of those practices or others will be appropriate for them. They'll be attracted to that. They'll be able to perform it that way. And if they do it with the right attitude, this notion of the ingredients, the action, the equipment themselves are all ultimately coming from Brahman, then they're freed of sins and approach Brahman or approach transcendence. So here in 433, Krishna says, O chastiser of the enemy, the sacrifice performed in knowledge is better than the mere sacrifice of material possessions. After all, O son of Pritha, all sacrifices of work culminate in transcendental knowledge. So again, he's making that distinction between performing sacrifice for temporary material gain or for transcendence. It's interesting, he says that all sacrifices of work culminate in transcendental knowledge, because even those who are performing sacrifices for a material gain, they are being purified to some extent. And other places it said that they gain faith from being in association with the Brahmins who perform sacrifices. They gain faith in the scriptures, and they can then develop the right attitude, which will allow them to go further. But it's a longer path. So he's has told Arjuna from the beginning that you should want to transcend, and so you take up the process of sacrifice, but do it in the right way. And that's an integral part of trying to move from the more theoretical understanding that he has as he's doing the karma yoga, and the realized deep understanding that comes from jnana, the mature practice of that. And this performance of sacrifice with that understanding, proper understanding, is a necessary and integral part of that process of maturation. And Prabhupada says in his purport to 433, he says, depending on differences in consciousness, sacrificial activities are sometimes called karma kanda, fruit of activities, and sometimes jnana kanda, or knowledge in pursuit of truth. It is better when the end is knowledge. So these two things have been pointed out a few times by Krishna and by the commentators. That that sacrifice just in general is good and necessary for everybody, but we're interested here in a particular type that aims us at transcendence. So in 434, moving along, he gives the second of the new ingredients to attaining transcendental knowledge. And this is a very famous verse amongst the devotees. Tad vidipranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadikshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshinaha. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized souls can impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. Okay? And Prabhupada in his purport I have a couple of excerpts from it here. Unless there is submission and service, inquiries from the learned spiritual master will not be effective. One must be able to pass the test of the spiritual master, and when he sees the genuine desire of the disciple, he automatically blesses the disciple with genuine spiritual understandings. So there's information and experience. The spiritual masters are part of a tradition. So we call it the parampara, the disciplic succession, which means that they're a part of a living tradition, which then has a lot of experience and understanding, practical experience, not just the theoretical knowledge, but the vijnana, or how the knowledge is applied. Many in our tradition, we have people for many years in all different walks of life, now in all different places of the world, who are trying to practice bhakti. And we can learn many things from them. There's a huge amount of collective experience there. And so there's a lot of wisdom. First of all, knowledge, and second of all, wisdom that these seers of the truth, the Tattvadarshis, have. But also it says that it's their significance also extends to blessings. He automatically blesses the disciple with genuine spiritual understanding. So they have the capacity through their good wishes to help you, and especially this is true of the devotees. That Krishna is grateful to them for their service and wishes to reciprocate with them. And so when they wish to give blessings to others to have devotional service, Krishna is happy to do that. But even others who are more on the jnani path, they have the ability to give blessings too. And then the second excerpt, Prabhupada says, in this verse, both blind following and absurd inquiries are condemned. Not only should one hear submissively from the spiritual master, but one must also get a clear understanding from him in submission and service and inquiries. So it's interesting, he says, both blind following and absurd inquiries are condemned. So he says, first of all, that if you want to have that knowledge, you have to show some respect for it. That's why it says you're submissive. You're at least thinking that this person may have something of use to you. Hopefully, it's more than that. But at least you have to think that this person may have something valuable, so that you're willing to listen with some respect and with some interest. And as that increases, and there should be service. You actually should to show some gratitude for them, help them. But this is also that we have to try to understand what's being taught. It's not just a question either of memorizing or accepting just on faith. It says that Prabhupada, in other places, we shouldn't surrender our intelligence. So we should see what the spiritual master is teaching. And does it correspond with the scriptures, and does it correspond with other practitioners? And we should not just try to memorize the exact words, but try to understand what they mean. We should be able to explain and understand and put into practice what we learn. So blind following. If somehow somebody is not on the right track, we shouldn't just say, they're the spiritual master, and follow blindly, or we shouldn't just imitate what they say exactly without trying to understand what does it mean. Try to actually understand the knowledge. So it involves. So he says that we should try get a clear understanding. So that means asking questions also. It also means being able to express doubts. That's not blind following, that's gaining an understanding. So I say, look, I don't understand this. It doesn't mean that it's absurd inquiries or trying to defeat them, Prabhupada says a challenging attitude, but an attitude of really trying to understand. And so if there's something you can't understand, something that's causing a doubt, that should be brought up. That's how it's cleared up. Otherwise, you say, I don't understand this, I don't believe in this, but I have such faith that I'll persist anyway. But no, you should try. You should try to engage with it, if at all possible, and to resolve the doubts and the questions. And that puts your faith on a firmer basis. Okay. So moving on to the section, for chapter 4, verses 35 through 38. So now he says that he describes the qualities and characteristics of transcendental knowledge. And because he said that by performing the sacrifice and by getting the blessings and the teachings from the spiritual master, one will attain transcendental knowledge. Okay, what does it look like? What does it do? That's what's going to be answered here in these verses. And that in text 435, Yajgyatva na punarmoham evam yasyasi pandava yena bhutan yasheshani drakshasyasyatmanyato mayi. Having obtained real knowledge from a self-realized soul, you will never fall again into such illusion, for by this knowledge you will see that all living beings are but part of the Supreme, or in other words, that they are mine. This is Mayi in me. They're Atmani in the Supreme Soul, Prabhupada says. In other words, he says, in me. So he says, once you've come to this understanding, you're not going to fall back into the misunderstanding that we're physical and mental creatures. This is, Krishna was teaching Arjuna right from the beginning that, he says, you're worrying about all the death that's about to happen on the battlefield, but he says, we've always existed, we're existing now, and we will always exist. And he explained how that happens, even though bodies come and go. He says, you won't forget your identity as a spiritual being after this. And also, you won't forget that you're in relationship with something greater than yourself. Both of those things are important. We tend to think of ourselves as very important. We're the only us, right? But here it says that we are all living beings, and we're part of the Supreme, and they belong to Krishna. That's what he says. So there's three kind of components in there. They're individual souls, and everybody is that, so we have equal importance there. It's not just that I'm eternal and you're not, or you're eternal and I'm not. We're all individual souls. We may have many differences externally, physically and mentally, maybe even in different sorts of bodies. But on the soul level, we're the same. And then Prabhupada he says the super soul, talks about the super soul, Atmani. He says in the Supreme Soul, and both he and then there's Krishna in me. Krishna saying in me. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he translated Atmani just to refer to the individual souls. But both Srila Prabhupada and Baladev Vidyabhushan, other main commentary, they both consider a reference to super soul. Prabhupada translates it in the word for word Atmani as in the Supreme Soul. And so that means super soul, the Paramatma. So those three things are present there in this transcendental knowledge. And then for those on the yoga ladder, they are beginning to transition from knowledge of the soul and Brahman to the understanding super soul and Krishna. You see, there's an interesting element here that Krishna's always trying to introduce gradually little bits of bhakti. And so here, it's not just that the Gyanis are supposed to understand Brahman and the individual themselves as a spirit soul, but that there's the super soul, which they'll become more aware of, and that there's also somehow Krishna is related. They belong to him. They're in him, And they don't have a sophisticated enough understanding to realize quite how that's working. But they should be thinking about that. They understand that, they're still probably thinking more or less that it's the Brahman that they're in. But he's saying specifically, it's me. He doesn't say my Brahman aspect or that. He says me. So he's giving them that notion, right, that there's Krishna behind everything, which will be very important as they transition into bhakti. So we're not physical or mental, not any kind of material being. We're spiritual beings. All of us are. And we're all existing in relationship with the Supreme Soul, the Paramatma, and we're all contained in Krishna. Krishna, Prabhupada says they're mine. In the word for word, he says, in me is my, even in the smooth translation, he says they're mine. We're owned by Krishna. That's the transcendental knowledge. So it's a powerful thing that it gives for a bhakta, it gives real impetus towards devotional service, as we'll see. Let's look here. Prabhupada says in this purport to this verse, the whole teaching of the Gita is targeted toward this end, that a living being, as Krishna's eternal servitor, cannot be separated from Krishna, and his sense of being an identity apart from Krishna is called Maya. And then another excerpt, he says, the result of receiving knowledge from a self-realized soul, or one who knows things as they are, is learning that all living beings are parts and parcels of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord Sri Krishna. So if we think about that, we consider that we're part of the Supreme, a small part, and that we're owned by the Supreme, the notion of serving and having some direct relationship makes sense. So Krishna is kind of setting up the foundation for that. And then Prabhupada says in 36 and 37, he says, Krishna says, even if you are considered to be the most sinful of all sinners. So we've found out what that knowledge is. And now we're going to hear something about its properties. When you are situated in the boat of transcendental knowledge, you will be able to cross over the ocean of miseries. And how does that happen? 437 says, as a blazing fire turns firewood to ashes, O Arjuna, so does the fire of knowledge burn to ashes all reactions to material activities. So that's how it happens. So it says he burns up. It says all the reactions. It says sarva karmani, all reactions to material activities. And Prabhupada says proper understanding of one's constitutional position. This is from 436 in his purport. In relationship to Krishna is so nice that it can at once lift one from the struggle for existence which goes on in the ocean of nescience, and perfect knowledge of the self and super-self, and their relationship is compared herein to fire. This fire not only burns up all reactions to impious activities, the sinful activities, but also all reactions to pious activities, turning them to ashes. And the word there is in the verse is sarva karmani, all actions, that means all reactions are burned away. That's because either one will keep us from transcending. Generally, people want to wipe out the sinful ones because they cause suffering and the material suffering, and the good ones produce material happiness. And so generally there's a big preference there. But if one is aiming at transcendence, both of them have to go away. And so sarva karmani. And then in 438, Krishna says, in this world, again saying more about this transcendental knowledge, there is nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Such knowledge is the mature fruit of all mysticism, and one who has become accomplished in the practice of devotional service enjoys this knowledge within himself in due course of time. And Prabhupada likes to use this word at different places. Oftentimes he says that Krishna consciousness is simultaneously easy and sublime. So I thought I would give us the quick definition of sublime, because he mentions it here. It is the nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Sublime, according to the Oxford Dictionary, says of such excellence, grandeur, or beauty as to inspire great admiration or awe. And then for people in the yoga ladder here, Prabhupada said that he called it, he says yoga samsiddha, who is mature in devotion. He translates yoga as devotion and samsiddha as mature. For the karma yogis, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the yoga ladder, then the yoga refers to the karma yogi, who's performing their duty without material desire. That's what Krishna's been describing for these since chapter 2, the second half of chapter 2. So it says that when that happens, it's something that takes time. So it's not instantaneous. When it becomes perfect, completely perfect, right? That song means completeness, and then siddha, it means perfection. So Prabhupada says mature, it means it really it comes to its full maturity and fruition. Then this knowledge comes about through all the different means that we've heard about so far. And then there's an interesting purport that Prabhupada gives in 438, and he says this knowledge is the mature fruit of devotional service. Okay, that's the one thing he says, mature fruit of devotional service. And when one is situated in transcendental knowledge, he need not search for peace elsewhere, for he enjoys peace within himself. And then he says, in other words, this knowledge and peace culminate in Krishna consciousness. That is the last word of the Bhagavad Gita. So I was puzzling over that a little bit, because first, the knowledge is the mature fruit of devotional service, which means that the devotional service is starting, and the knowledge is produced from it. And it's the fruit of it. And then elsewhere he says the knowledge and peace culminate in Krishna consciousness. So that means when the knowledge and peace are, have matured, then Krishna consciousness is there. He says this is the last word in Bhagavad Gita. But actually this makes sense, especially in a bhakti perspective. From the yoga ladder, it says the yoga is starting, and then that becomes mature and the knowledge develops. That's pretty clear from the Bhagavad Gita. From a bhakti standpoint, though, what Prabhupada's saying here it isn't contradictory, it makes a certain amount of sense. Because it's known from different places, we'll hear in the Bhagavad Gita and also in the Bhagavatam, that bhakti produces knowledge as one of its byproducts. It says there's causeless knowledge and renunciation come from the practice of bhakti. And also, though, our knowledge of being connected with Krishna, like this situation where we're Krishnas, we're in Krishna, we're connected with the super soul, we're either in Krishna or owned by Krishna. It's called sambandha, the knowledge of relationship. And that's a stimulus to surrender. So one of the things that helps us to take up the path of bhakti with some determination and enthusiasm is that understanding of that we are spirit souls, parts and parcels of Krishna. And that we have an eternal relationship with him. We don't know what that is, but we have that. And so the initial sambandha, the understanding that we are souls, eternal beings with an eternal relationship with a greater being, impels us to surrender and take up the process of devotional service. And so that kind of knowledge culminates in us taking up Krishna consciousness. When we take up Krishna consciousness, there's a deeper level of knowledge that comes about. That initial knowledge we have deepens and becomes more experienced, and then it even produces something deeper than that, which is our understanding of our specific relationship with Krishna. So that's how I take that. It's more of this is a bhakti type of take on that. For the yoga ladder, though, it says the people are performing this karma yoga, they're performing sacrifices, they're trying to meditate on Krishna as they're doing things. They're surrendering their results of their actions unto Him, and then this knowledge develops as a perfection. It becomes fully perfect. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of chapter 4. We've discovered now how that transition takes place, at least more so, and what it looks like. That we heard at the end of chapter 2, and that we heard also in chapter 4, how when the karma yogis' practice becomes mature and they have this. It was in the second chapter. It was profound knowledge. Sthita pragyasya, situated in profound knowledge. This is what it means. It means they know that they're spirit souls, and they know that they're in a relationship with Krishna and usually with the super soul. So here in the final text, 39 through 42, Krishna does a couple things. He shows that there's a need for faith, and he kind of gives a final conclusion for Arjuna. This is what you should do. Now you've heard this, now you should feel comfortable to carry on with your duties. So in 39, Krishna says, a faithful man, a Shraddhavan, who is dedicated to transcendental knowledge and who subdues his senses is eligible to achieve such knowledge. And having achieved it, he quickly attains the supreme spiritual peace. And he says, but, in text 440, ignorant and faithless persons who doubt the revealed scriptures do not attain God consciousness. They fall down. For the doubting soul, there is happiness neither in this world nor in the next. And remember, this kind of reminds me at least of going back to text 241, where he said you needed that resolute determination. And in the purport there, Prabhupada he identified that as faith. You have to have a faith to have that firm understanding and resolution. Firm understanding and resolution, that's also what faith is. They're kind of interchangeable terms in many ways. Faith is just not the will to believe something, but there's an element of understanding. It's a very strong element of understanding. It's a function of the intelligence, not just willpower. That I will myself to believe something. And so that produces a confidence, a faith. And then in 441 and 442, so that we should hear. We should hear what Krishna is saying. Prabhupada says in one of his purports, he says that that we should believe in what the Bhagavad Gita says. He says here we're being given this very important information, and so we should study it. We should do some spiritual practice, and we should try to develop some faith in it. So see that it works, and that's what will allow us to have the same kind of firm resolution to allow us to aim for transcendence. Otherwise, it's difficult. So 441. Krishna says, one who acts in devotional service, renouncing the fruits of his actions, and whose doubts have been destroyed by transcendental knowledge, is situated factually in the self. Thus he is not bound by reactions of work, O conqueror of riches. So he's mentioning somebody who's become mature, and so he's suggesting to Arjuna that he can become it that way. And so he says, therefore the doubts which have arisen in your heart out of ignorance should be slashed by the weapon of knowledge. Armed with yoga, O Bharata, stand and fight. So all these different doubts that Arjuna has had from the beginning, that he was going to cause all kinds of misfortune, that his life was going to be ruined in so many ways, he was going to be subject to sinful reactions, that so much harm was going to come to society, that even if he is a spirit soul, but he should then just take up the path of knowledge and shouldn't perform these ghastly activities. All these things he's saying should be now. All these things should be dissipated. Now that you understand that your duty can be done in such a way, right, that it leads to transcendence, that all the sinful reactions are gone, that you'll be accessing the reality, you and your relationship with me. So all these activities they should no longer. All these doubts should be gone. You should stand up and you should fight. And that's the conclusion of chapter 4. He says, there now you should go ahead. He keeps repeating the same thing to him. You should fight. So we have a few minutes left, and we will try to introduce chapter 5. We can't really get as deeply into it as I had hoped, but Arjuna becomes confused once again, and makes another plea for not taking part in the battle. It's interesting because Krishna says, now your doubt should be finished, please fight. But a couple of the usages of words that he gave in the last two verses causes Arjuna to have renewed doubt. And so Arjuna says in the 5:1, Arjuna Uvacha, Arjuna says, Sannyasam karmanam Krishna punar yogam cha shangsasi yat treya etayor ekam tanme bruhi sunishchitam. Arjuna says, "Oh Krishna, first of all you ask me to renounce work, and then again you recommend work with devotion. Now will you kindly tell me definitely which of the two is more beneficial?" And so he uses these two words, sannyasam and karmanam, renunciation and activities. And the confusion, the acharyas say, especially Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he says it comes from these two usages that Krishna gives. In text 441, he says, yoga sannyasta karmanam. And Prabhupada, he translates yoga as devotional service, as he will do. Or he says devotional service in karma yoga, actually. That's how Prabhupada translates it there. Sannyasta, one who has renounced, and karmanam, Prabhupada translates that as the fruits of actions, which is actually what Krishna is saying. And that's what we'll find out. But if you look at it just literally, it just means actions. We had that whole discussion about what is action, what is inaction. So sometimes inaction means having no reactions. It doesn't mean not acting. But the literal thing just means actions. Karmanam just means action. Prabhupada gives the translation that gives the real intention of Krishna, the fruits of actions. But if you take it as in yoga, renouncing action in yoga, that's your yoga, is to renounce action. And then in the text 42, he says, yogam atishta tishta bharata. Yogam, again, Prabhupada says in yoga, atishta, be situated, and utishta, stand up and fight. So he says, on the one hand, it looks like, by being in yoga, you renounce all your activities. But now in yoga, stand up and fight, which sure looks like an activity. So Arjuna took it that he was instructed to renounce all action in yoga in 441, but then urged to stand up and fight in yoga in 442. So he has a confusion that he asks. So tell me which is better. First you're telling me to renounce everything, then you're telling me to act. What's the best way to do it? Okay. And Prabhupada says in the purport, 5.1, he says, in other words, that means Arjuna, thinks that sannyas or renunciation in knowledge should be altogether free from all kinds of activity, because work and renunciation appear to him to be incompatible. He appears not to have understood that work in knowledge is non-reactive and is therefore the same as inaction. He inquires therefore whether he should cease work altogether or work with full knowledge. And then in text 2 and 3, and we'll conclude here pretty quickly, the personality of God had replied, the renunciation of work and work in devotion, or in yoga, are both good for liberation. But of the two, work in devotional service is better than renunciation of work. So he says he wants him to act. He wants him to fight, just like he concluded. One who neither hates, this is 5.3, or desires the fruits of his activities is known always to be renounced as nitya sannyasi. Is always renounced. That's what it means. You don't have any material desire in your action. We talked about that in chapter 2, where it said that that type of person could completely withdraw the senses from their objects and remain inactive like the tortoise, or they could act with their senses without attachment and aversion. And those were both legitimate transcendental ways for them to act. It wasn't a fall down or a come down for them to act in that way. So that's what Krishna says. He says, such a person free from all dualities easily overcomes material bondage and is completely liberated, O mighty Arjuna. And then Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Baladev Vidyabhushan, they explain that karma yoga enhance and protect transcendental knowledge and help guard against fall down. So that that we understood how the transcendental knowledge came from the practice of karma yoga, and that practicing the karma yoga doesn't in any way diminish the transcendental knowledge. In fact, it supports it and increases it, it stabilizes it, it guards against fall down. So that sometimes somebody who's not acting at all, something can come to them. Some desire or something can come to them, and they have a chance of maybe of doing something they shouldn't do. Whereas by being active and doing it in the right way, it keeps their knowledge more stable and reduces the risks of having them make a mistake. And Prabhupada says a similar thing in his purport to 5.2. He says, activities performed in full knowledge strengthen one's advancement in real knowledge. And that's kind of what they're saying also. And then, so therefore, he says, and also in the purport, there's a couple more excerpts from his purport of 5.2. Prabhupada says, therefore, jnana, or knowledge that one is not this material body but spirit soul, is not sufficient for liberation. Now, here he's coming at a specific bhakti perspective, but it's an important one. He says that jnana, or knowledge that one is not this material body but spirit soul, is not sufficient for liberation. One has to act in the status of spirit soul, otherwise there is no escape from material bondage. And then he said, and so this is kind of important, because we've heard a lot about liberation, and even Krishna is using the term, but we know there's different statuses of liberation. And so there's ones that are kind of Brahma Nirvanam, which just means the cessation of material things, and can mean attainment of the Brahma Jyotir. Or there's, as Krishna really is going to ask us to do, is to come to him. He says that people come to him. That's the real liberation, because he says that one has to act in the status of spirit soul in order to attain Krishna. Bhakti is active, where spiritual persons are connected with Krishna. And so if we simply merge into the Brahma Jyoti, it's technically a kind of liberation. That's a fact. But it's explained it's not stable, and it's not a fully developed liberation. And then Prabhupada says that one should understand that factually nothing belongs to anyone. Then where is the question of renunciation? One who knows that everything is Krishna's property is always situated in renunciation. Since everything belongs to Krishna, everything should be employed in the service of Krishna. So this is a particularly bhakti way of dealing with this yoga of action. Right? Instead of doing one's duty without the desire for material benefit, or even as a kind of a sacrifice, we're doing everything to please Krishna. And with that attitude, even though there may be so many things, there may be so many things there. Prabhupada said that, Prabhupada had so many, he would sometimes brag, in India he would sometimes brag like this, that we have so many centers, so many vehicles, we're distributing so many books, we're doing so many things. They're all being used in the service, that's renunciation. So even having a small amount of things, using it for one's own personal pleasure, and not seeing it as belonging to Krishna is not renounced. So even if there's a lot of things there, but it's genuinely being used, not generally, but genuinely being used in Krishna's service, that's renunciation and bhakti. The other thing I'm seeing here too is Krishna keeps engaging Arjuna in action, and to me it seems that part of it is the underlying purpose that Krishna has. He wants to lead everyone to bhakti, which is an active process. He doesn't want people to stop at just regular renunciation or jnana, although he does have a way for them. We hear in chapter 6 how someone who's really mature in that jnana can cease activities and begin meditation. So there is kind of a way forward for them even so. But bhakti itself is an active process, as we read in the Nectar of Instructions, how it's a cultivation. We actively want to do something for Krishna. And so, to me anyway, Krishna's continued insistence on action is consistent with his overall purpose of taking us to bhakti.